Today we will do part 3 of Syllogism, Moods and Enthymemes. Here first we will revise the rules of syllogism. First rule is that the categorical syllogism must contain 3 and only 3 propositions. Secondly, the categorical syllogism must contain 3 and only 3 terms. Third, the middle term must be distributed at least once in the premises. Fourth, the minor term cannot be distributed in the conclusion unless it is distributed in the minor premise. Fourth, the major term cannot be distributed in the conclusion unless it is distributed in the major premise. Next, if one of the premise is negative, then the conclusion must be negative. Next, no conclusion can be drawn from the two negative premises. Next, if both the premises are affirmative, then the conclusion must be affirmative. Next is, if one of the premise is particular, the conclusion must be particular. Next is, no conclusion can be drawn from two particular propositions. Next is, from a particular major premise and a negative minor premise, no conclusion can be drawn. That is, from I and E proposition, no conclusion can be drawn. Now we come to the moods. We already know that the figures of syllogism depends upon the position of the middle term. The moods depend on the quality and quantity of the constituent proposition, that is, whether the proposition is affirmative or negative or universal or particular. The term mood is used in three senses, that is, the form of syllogism as determined by the quantity and quality of the premises, and secondly, the form of syllogism as determined by the quality and quantity of all the three propositions, and thirdly, the form of syllogism in which the conclusion is validly drawn. Thus, there are 16 moods in each figure. That will be 16 into 4 is 64 moods. But the combinations EE, EO, OE and OO commits the fallacy of negative premises. Both are negative, and so no conclusion can be drawn from these combinations of proposition. So they are rejected. EE, EO, OE and OO are rejected. Then the combination II, IO and OI are two particular premises. So no conclusion can be drawn. Hence they are also rejected. What are they? II, IO and OI are rejected. Then the combination IE is also rejected because from a particular major premise and a negative minor premise, no conclusion can be drawn. And also it commits the fallacy of illicit measure. So IE is also rejected. So only 8 combinations are left which yield valid conclusions or valid moods. Let us see what are they. AA, AE is second one, AI is third, AO is fourth, EA is fifth, EI is sixth, IA is seventh, and OA is eighth. These are the 8 combinations which yield valid conclusions. Now we will be studying the valid moods and rules of figures. Each figure has different rules. The methods of finding valid moods. we'll have to take all the 8 combinations and consider them in different figures of syllogism. Or the second method is determining the special rules of the figures. Then, on the basis of those rules, find out the combinations of valid modes. And we are going to follow the second method, where the rules depend on the position of the middle term in the figures. Now we'll see the rule of figure 1. Here we know that the middle term stands as the subject in the major premise and the predicate in the minor premise. Here the major premise, let us see. The first premise is the major premise and the second is minor premise, where the middle term M stands as the subject in the major premise and predicate in the minor premise. On these positions, two rules are stated. That is, the minor premise must be affirmative. Which are the affirmative propositions? A and I. And second is the major premise must be universal. What does that mean? The major premise must be either A or E proposition. These are the two rules of figure 1. Now we will prove the rule 1 of figure 1. What is the rule 1 of figure 1? The rule is that the minor premise must be affirmative. Now here we will suppose that the minor premise is negative. Okay, we will suppose it that it is negative. Then what will happen? Then the conclusion will be negative, because as per the rule of syllogism, if one of the premises is negative, then the conclusion must be negative. And not only that, the major premise will be affirmative, because as per the rule of syllogism, conclusion can be drawn only if one of the premises is negative. If both are negative, then no conclusion will be drawn. So, the minor premise and the conclusion, since it is negative, will be E or O proposition, and the major premise, since it is affirmative, it will be A or I proposition in figure 1. Now, since the conclusion is negative, it will distribute its predicate. Why? Because we know that only negative propositions distribute their predicates. Now it will distribute the predicate, which is the major term in the major premise. See in the figure, you can see figure 1, where does the major term lie? In the major premise, and it is the predicate of that proposition. Since the major premise is an affirmative proposition, that is A or I, its predicate is undistributed in the major premise. So, this argument will commit the fallacy of illicit measure. Thus, our assumption that the minor premise must be negative is false, and the rule 1 of figure 1, that is the minor premise must be affirmative, is proved to be true. Now we'll prove the rule 2 of figure 1. What is the rule 2 of figure 1? That the major premise must be universal. This has to be proved, but as per the rule 1 of figure 1, the minor premise must be affirmative. This has been proved. So it must be either A or I proposition. If it is A or I proposition, that is affirmative proposition, then the minor premise will not distribute the middle term. Why? Because in the minor premise, in the figure 1, What is the middle term? The middle term stands as the predicate of that proposition. And we know that if it, it is an affirmative proposition and if the middle term is the predicate of that proposition, then it will be undistributed, because in affirmative propositions the predicates are undistributed. So then the option is left that it should be at least distributed once, no? So it should be distributed at least in the measure premise. Okay. So measure premise, the middle term must be distributed, but in the measure premise, the middle term stands as the subject of that proposition. Right? So if it stands as the subject of that proposition, means that proposition must be universal. Then only the subject term of that proposition will be distributed, because only universal propositions distribute the subject terms. So since it stands as the subject of that proposition, of that measure premise, the measure premise must be a universal proposition. That is either A or E proposition. Hence, the rule 2 of figure 1, that is, the measure premise must be universal, is proved to be true. Now, let us know which are the valid modes of figure 1. As per the rule of figure 1, there are two rules. First rule is that the minor premise must be affirmative, and the second rule is that the measure premise must be universal. These are the two main rules of figure 1. From these two rules, we get the valid modes. So from this, it follows that when we apply the two rules of figure 1 to the 8 combinations, 4 of the combination will not yield valid conclusions. What are those combinations? That is, AE and AO are rejected. Why? Because the minor premise is negative here. E is negative and O is negative. Whereas, as per the rule, the minor premise must be affirmative. So, this combinations are rejected. Then, the combination IA and OA are also rejected. Why? Because the major premise in both these combinations are particular propositions, but as per the rule, the major premise must be universal. So then we are left with the only 4 combinations, and what are they which will yield valid conclusions in figure 1? They are AA combination, AI combination, EA combination and EI combination. Let us take the valid moves of figure 1, the combination of AA propositions. Now, here in this combination, both the premises are universal, so the conclusion can be. Possibility is there that it can be universal. Then both the premises are affirmative, then the conclusion must be affirmative. This is the rule 3 of quality in syllogism, that both the premises are affirmative, then the conclusion must be affirmative. Now, since in this combination, the minor premise, you can see here minor premise is this premise, which is A proposition. The second premise is A proposition. So the subject of A proposition is always distributed. Hence, the subject of this minor premise will also be distributed. If the subject of the minor premise is distributed, then it has to be distributed. The subject term has also to be distributed in the conclusion. Then only the argument will be valid. This is the rule of syllogism. So it will be distributed in the conclusion only if it is an universal proposition, because we know that in an universal proposition only the subject terms are distributed. So then hence we can say that the conclusion must be an universal affirmative proposition. See here, we have seen that the premise is affirmative, so the conclusion must be affirmative. Okay, so now here we are saying that it should be universal. So here it should be affirmative, here it should be universal. Hence, we will conclude that the conclusion will be universal affirmative, that is a proposition. So here we'll get the valid mood is A, and it is called as Barbara. Let us take an example of Barbara, that is first valid mood of first figure. A combination. All flowers are red. All roses are flowers. All roses are red. Here the middle term is flowers. And the subject term is roses. And the predicate term is red. So we get figure 1, and this is the valid mood. Why it is the valid mood? Because it does not commit any fallacies. See here, the subject term is distributed in the minor premise as well as the conclusion, means in the conclusion as well as the minor premise. Then the predicate term is also distributed in the is undistributed in the conclusion, so no need of seeing it in the premise. Then the middle term is distributed in the first premise, the major premise, so it does not violate any rule. It does not violate any rule of quality also, of structure also, nothing. It's a valid move of Barbara, A combination. Now let us take the second combination of figure 1 and see which mood we get, valid mood we get. Combination here is AI. In this combination, both the propositions are affirmative, so obviously the conclusion will be affirmative as per the rule of syllogism, rule 3 of quality. The minor premise is particular, so the conclusion will be particular. This is the corollary rule of syllogism. So, obviously, the conclusion has to be particular affirmative. If it is particular affirmative, then the conclusion will be I. So, this mood is AII, and it is called as Darii. Now let us take an example of this valid mood 2 of figure 1, that is the rye. All mangoes are sweet. Some fruits are mangoes, therefore some fruits are sweet. The combination is AII. Here the middle term will be mangoes and the subject term will be fruits and the predicate term will be sweet. Here also it's a valid mood because it fits into all the rules. It does not violate any rules of syllogism. The fruits means the subject term and the predicate term are undistributed in the conclusion, so no need of seeing them in the premises since it is an I proposition. And then the middle term is also distributed in the first major premise since it is the subject of A proposition. So it does not violate any rule. Neither it violates any rule of quality, quantity, nothing. That we have already proved. Okay, so this is the valid mood 2 of figure 1. Darii, its combinations are A, I. Let us see the third combination of figure 1, that is EA. Since in this combination one of the premises is negative, so the conclusion will be negative. As per the rule of syllogism, if one of the premises is negative, the conclusion must be negative. Now both the premises are universal, so the conclusion may be universal. As we can see in the figure that the minor term in the minor premise, the minor term is the subject of that premise, right? So it is distributed in the minor premise because it is an universal proposition, that is a proposition as per the combination. So this subject term will be distributed since it is an universal proposition. As in universal propositions, only the subject term is distributed. Since it is distributed in the minor premise, it has to be distributed in the conclusion also. So the conclusion must be universal proposition. And since it should be also negative, we will get the conclusion as universal negative, that is E proposition. Hence, this mood is EAE and it is called as Celarent. Let us take an example of valid mood 3, Celarent of figure 1, that is EAE combination. No animals are birds, all tigers are animals, therefore no tigers are birds. Here the middle term is animals and the subject term is tigers. Predicate term is birds. You can see that it does not violate any rule of distribution, quality or structure of syllogism, neither the rules of corollaries or enthymemes. So it's a valid mood. Now we come to valid mood of figure 1, the combination 4, that is EI. In this combination, the major premise is negative and the minor premise is particular. So obviously the conclusion will be particular negative, that is O proposition. This mood is EIO and it will be called as Ferio. This mood is Ferio. Let us take an example of valid mood 4 of figure 1, that is Ferio. EIO. No successful persons are poor. Some hard workers are successful. Therefore, some hard workers are not poor. Middle term is successful. Subject term is hard workers. And the predicate term is poor. So here it also does not violate any rules of syllogism. So it's a valid move. Ferio. EIO. So we'll just recollect now the rules of figure 1 and the valid rules of figure 1. Rules of figure 1 are that the minor premise must be affirmative and the second one is the major premise must be universal. The combinations, the valid moods. What are they? A combination, Barbara. I combination, Darai. Third, EAE combination, Celarent, and EIO combination, Ferio. These are the 4 valid moods of figure 1. So we have studied all the valid moods of figure 1. and the rules of figure 1 in this session. Thank you. We'll continue in the next session, figure 2.